The policing of protest, the island community hosting asylum seekers, and will gay conversion therapy be banned? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Shadow Treasury Minister James Murray, Conservative MP Heather Wheeler, the editor of The Mirror Alison Phillips, and Tim Stanley of the Daily Telegraph. On today's programme.
The Home Secretary, I know, is talking to the police. The police are rightly operationally independent. We expect them to use the full force of the law.
The police are independent operationally, so these are decisions for them. But I think there have already been identified some gaps in the law.
The Home Secretary will meet the Metropolitan Police Commissioner over the policing of a protest by the Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir. Migrants reboard the barge on Portland. We hear from local residents.
These men have suffered. We have a right to treat them with dignity.
Charity begins at home.
They've got everything that a lot of people on Portland haven't got.
The LGBT Action Plan consists of 75 actions that the government will take in order to address the survey's findings. These include the commitment to end the practice of conversion therapy in the UK.
The Equalities Minister in 2018, but is the government about to drop its ban on conversion therapy? Let's start with the front page of the Daily Mail. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, fury at Met over jihad chants. Home Secretary to confront police chief after his officers are accused of doing nothing as anti-Israel protesters incited terror. This is in response to a protest on Saturday by the radical Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir. They were protesting outside the Egyptian and Turkish embassies. Let's just take a look at part of the rally.
What is the solution to liberate people in the concentration camp called Palestine?
Jihad!
What is the solution?
Jihad! Jihad!
You can hear jihad being chanted. The Metropolitan Police said in a statement on Saturday it hadn't identified any offences regarding this protest, adding that the word jihad had a number of meanings, anything from struggle to holy war. The Home Office Minister, Robert Jenrick, though, said the chants were completely reprehensible. I never want to see scenes like that again. It's inciting terrorist violence and needs to be tackled with the full force of the law. Well, just a few moments ago, I spoke to Sarah Khan, who is the former Commissioner for Countering Extremism.
The Metropolitan Police are right in saying that there are different interpretations of what jihad means. So technically, no, it doesn't necessarily incite violence in this country. I mean, I was very concerned to see the demonstrations by Hizb ut-Tahrir, the chanting. I was concerned to see banners calling on Muslim armies to go to that part of the world. And I think that is a really incredibly worrying climate. But as my report showed from 2021, there are unfortunately gaps in the legislation which is allowing extremist groups to operate with impunity, to engage in what could be extremist activity, who are able to incite hatred against others, but fall short below any kind of from any type of terrorism legislation, and it's not being caught by hate crime legislation, which is why, therefore, as part of my recommendations to the government, one of them was to create and devise a new legal framework to capture this specific activity that is currently not being caught by any existing legislation.
And that's the gap, in the law as far as you're concerned. Why do you think it hasn't been done?
So, I mean, there's two things. I mean, in terms of gaps in the law, there are gaps in terms of, I mean, and again, I suspect your viewers will be quite shocked to hear this, as I was when we carried out this review, is that in this country, it is currently lawful, for example, to glorify terrorism as long as it does not encourage or instigate or you're involved in the preparation of terrorism. So as an example, if individuals or terrorists or if individuals or groups in this country decided to praise terrorist activity, spread the ideology of terrorist groups like Hamas, for example, that is currently lawful in this country as long as you're not engaged or you're encouraging people to engage in activity or are involved in the preparation or instigation of terrorism. Now, that's really shocking. And it's precisely those gaps in our legislation which is allowing extremist activity, extremists to exploit the law in our country and to do what they are doing. I mean, the reason why the Home Office haven't responded to those recommendations was a very good question. I think that's a question that the Home Secretary ultimately has to answer. I don't know why she's not taken those recommendations forward. I think it's also important to note, Joe, that after the inquiry into the Manchester bombing arena as well from 2017, Sir John Saunders this year also urged the Home Secretary as a matter of urgency to respond to the recommendations from that report that I published back in 2021. So I am just, to be honest, just dismayed that we've seen the scenes that we've seen on Saturday, when actually I do think some of this could have been prevented if those recommendations had been acted on.
So what do you make of the fact that Suella Braverman says, I mean, she's quoted as being furious at the Met over the jihad chants and not arresting people, and she's going to speak to Sir Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, and yet you obviously feel she has got questions to answer herself?
Well, Sir Mark Rowley, actually, he co-authored that report with me, so he is also very aware, very clear on what the legislation is and is not covering. So he's best placed to speak to the Home Secretary about those gaps in the legislation. As I said, I just feel very sad that we've had to witness this type of activity and behaviour. I know, having watched the activity of Hizb ut-Tahrir for decades in this country, the harm it's causing to people in terms of radicalising young people, undermining social cohesion, creating hatred against other groups of people in our country, that this is something that can be prevented. And I really do hope that the government and the Home Office in particular now use this opportunity to clamp down, I guess, on the extremist groups who are able to operate in this space and to improve our legislation in this area.
Do you think Hizb ut-Tahrir should be a prescribed organisation?
I think if we had devised a legal framework that sought to outlaw hateful extremist activities in this country, I think it would be possible to create a set of prescription laws and legislation in this country that would be able to prescribe organisations that are engaged in hateful extremist activity. And I think Hizb ut-Tahrir is an organisation like that. You only need to look at their constitution, you only need to look at what they stand for. You know, as I said, I believe they are creating a climate that's conducive to radicalisation. The harm is, you know, let's be very clear about the harm that they are causing. And they have no place in our democracy in terms of the harm, serious harm that they're causing. So I do believe that they could be prescribed if we draw a very clear legal framework, as I've identified, which also ensures that we don't restrict civil liberties in this country.
Sara Khan, thank you.
Thank you.
Heather Wheeler, does the law need to be tightened up? Because the police say they are acting within the law as it currently stands when it comes to inciting violence.
I think the answer to that is clearly it does. I mean, I'm shocked to hear that this report has been sitting with the civil servants since 2021. Because that's where the blockage is going to be. It won't be Priti Patel didn't want to do it, or it won't be Suella Braverman didn't want to do it.
It would be up to the politicians. They would have been notified about this and they've resisted it.
I don't think they've resisted it. My take is that's sitting on a desk of a civil servant.
But you want the law to be tightened up. You'd like the police to have more powers to arrest people at protests like this if they're using words like jihad.
Absolutely. One of the things that I saw in the film, a slightly longer clip of it, was a father taking away 2 of his children when that man started shouting out jihad. And I thought, well, there is hope in the world when he realises he doesn't want his children to be at what he thought was a pro-Palestinian gathering and turned into an incitement to jihad. I think that's outrageous.
Right, gaps in the law, Sir Keir Starmer says. So he too would like to see the law tightened up.
Yeah, I think absolutely. There are clearly gaps in the law, and it's really disturbing to hear in your clip there, you know, these gaps have been identified for several years, and yet the government has not closed them, because there must be absolutely no place on our streets for threatening or extremist behaviour. And we need to make sure that our politicians are putting in place the right laws in place so the police can then enforce them.
Right. I mean, we've just had the number 10 lobby meeting where they talk to journalists, a spokesperson for Rishi Sunak, who says there are no plans at the moment to give more power to the police. In fact, the implication is they feel the police aren't enforcing the existing laws. But having listened to what Sara Khan says, do you think that's true?
Well, she's an expert in it, and interestingly, it was Rowley, the commissioner was the
Yes, Sir Mark Rowley.
Sir Mark Rowley. So we need to look at that again. And if it needs legislation, I doubt that there's a chance to get it done by the 7th of November in the King's Speech, but you never know.
Right. Do you think it should be toughened up, or do you think that the police are acting within the laws that they have and actually should just be a little bit more true to the spirit of the current terror laws?
I think the the police at the weekend were probably acting within the remit that they had. Because remember, when they were looking at a lot of that detail as well, it's not just a police officer sitting there on his own. They had people from the CPS with them. So they had lawyers from the CPS saying, this isn't enough to warrant an arrest. So that was what they did at that point. And if I was Smart Riley getting sort of fairly publicly rounded upon in the press this morning by the Home Secretary, I would be saying, hang on a minute, I created this report. I've been doing my end of the bargain, which is policing these and trying to bring some sense of security to London. Meanwhile, the Home Secretary and previous Home Secretaries haven't done their end of the bargain, which is to actually give them the legislation that they require.
Heather?
Yeah, getting legislation through Parliament is a blooming long job, and it's just horrendous. I mean, we recently changed a thing on mobile home, park homes, and that's taken me 5 years of banging on about it. It was an SI. It took no time at all to get it done, but it's just the machinery of government.
Except
it's
that
horrendous.
We have seen some horrendous consequences of terrorism in this country over the last 10 years. This surely had to be a number one priority.
I don't think we need any new legislation.
You don't?
No. We need to enforce the laws that currently exist, and I cannot, seeing that clip, understand how any police officer could not have drawn the conclusion that was something they could intervene in on the basis that so under our current laws, you can intervene if, one, you are threatening violence directly to another individual, or you are doing anything which encourages terrorism. Now, I understand the semantic argument about what does jihad mean. I'm a Christian. If I talk about moral crusade, someone could interpret that simply to mean a religious act. Some people could interpret it to mean a militaristic one with historical consequences, and the same goes with jihad. But when Hizb ut-Tahrir says that, in the context of 1,400 Israelis being murdered, on the streets, in that location, with that rhetorical force, we know what that means. Now, and what I find so strange is that on other occasions, the police have apparently found the laws to be perfectly satisfactory in order to arrest people who have prayed silently outside abortion clinics, or Christian preachers who in the street have said that gay marriage is not biblical. For some reason, the law is quite clear in their mind. But on this occasion, on that occasion, they suddenly decided that calling for jihad was nothing more than a sort of spontaneous addition of songs of praise. I'm sorry, this is nonsense. The police have got to get their house in order because they are making themselves look like fools.
But,
okay, yes, go on, Alison.
No, but I was going to say, but in a situation where they've got to go and arrest somebody, they've got to do that with the knowledge that it could lead to a reasonable prosecution. So it gets all the way to court. And if they've got lawyers with them saying that this is no way this is going to get to court, they can't. I mean, your point about abortion clinics is also interesting. And what we need is a police that are completely apolitical, but it feels what's happening more and more is they're becoming a battering ram for politicians and for interest groups.
Right, but the interpretation that they gave the police was about the word jihad could have different meanings, and that was their reason.
And it does have different meanings.
Right, and that was their...
And by the way, this is why I'm also against new legislation. I'm reluctant to have the state getting involved in defining what religious language means and under what conditions it might mean something that the police can become involved in. What I'm saying is that under the current acts, the police had more than a right to step in and intervene, and they have done so elsewhere for offences that, in some cases, were later dropped.
Right. I mean, has he got a point, Tim, that actually the existing law should cover this? It's about the police understanding what is an offence and what isn't an offence. They don't need more powers.
Well, look, I'd welcome more information from the police about why they took their decision. You know, they're operationally independent. I think it's fair to ask for information about how they've taken that decision. But I think that...
I'm sorry, we know why the police didn't do it, because they had the time and the wit to tweet a religious commentary on what was being said rather than actually step in and arrest the man.
We need to understand why the police took that decision. But also, you know, it is very clear that there are gaps in the legislation. You know, we have this review which has been there for several years, and I think it is the government's responsibility, it is ministers' responsibility to make sure the right legislation is there in place to make sure there is no room for threatening or extremist behaviour on our streets.
Right, well, let's talk about the group itself, Hizb ut-Tahrir. There have been calls for the Islamist group to be banned. Tony Blair said he was going to do it, and this was way back in the 2000s, and it hasn't happened. Should it have done?
So I don't know the whole history of it back to the 2000s.
But should it be banned now?
Well, certainly looking at those clips is extremely disturbing. You know, and I want to see full action taking the full force of the law to make sure that the right legislation is in place and it's enforced.
Right. Well, it wasn't banned by Tony Blair. It wasn't banned, the group, either by David Cameron, who became Prime Minister afterwards.
And not, by the way, because it didn't... I'm sorry, just to say, Blair didn't ban it, not because it sat on a civil servant's desk. No. It was a choice not to ban it.
Absolutely. No, these are politician choices.
The group, of course, is banned in many other countries. I believe all but 3 Arab countries currently ban that organisation. organisation. But my understanding is the decision was taken that it would actually encourage recruitment for extremists if you ban. So I come back to my point about the problem with just pouring out more legislation. To what extent does this actually encourage extremism? Very often groups that carry out violent or rhetorically extreme demonstrations want to be banned. They want to promote a reaction. Maybe the time has come, in the context of what happened in Israel, to ban this group. But I'm just very wary of various commentators and politicians, whenever there's an incident like this, coming in and saying, right, legislation, because as you have pointed out, if nothing else, it takes a very long time to legislate when we currently have laws on our books that the police could enforce now.
Should they be banned?
Well, what I was really interested in is why they were having these demonstrations outside the Egyptian embassy and also the Turkish embassy. So
separate to the main pro-Palestinian rally in London. Yeah.
So it was not really about having a conversation with the British public, it was more having a conversation with the locals. And what they are doing is not just inciting violence in Palestine and Israel, but maybe in those countries as well. And so the fact that you've told us that Hizb ut-Tahrir is legislated against in many of the Arab countries, I mean, they're worried as well, aren't they?
Yeah. So should it be banned here?
I'm sure many of my colleagues would agree with that.
Alison?
I think it's looking like there's a very good reason why it should. But I do take Tim's point, and that's why
they'll pop up as something else, though, won't they?
Well, and that we just push extremism elsewhere, and we already know how difficult it is to monitor.
Right, well, let's have a look at something else over the weekend. It was on Saturday too, where a tube driver appeared to lead passengers. They were on their way to a pro-Palestinian rally. Let's have a listen to what happened.
Palestine! 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 Palestine!
So you can hear over the tannoy, free, free, and then the passengers on the tube saying Palestine. They were on their way to that rally, to the demonstration. Investigations into the video by the Metropolitan Police and Transport for London continue. Is there anything wrong with this?
Yes, it's completely wrong. And regardless, before we get into the question of the nature of the chant itself, it's unprofessional. No one should be doing that in a public sector position, leading that kind of political chant on the tube. But I have to say, I'm not personally Jewish. Nobody's perfect. But if I were, right now, I'd be asking myself, does the British society really back me? Does it have my side? Because in the last few days, after the murders of so many Jewish people, we've had one institution after another failing, whether it be taking Hamas's word literally, refusing to call them terrorists, the police failing to step in, these chants. All of what we've seen in the West in the last few days has reinforced the case for Israel. Why, unless the Jews have their own homeland, it just doesn't feel like they're safe.
Alison?
I agree with Tim on that point. And as to this should never have happened. And that chant, as it continues, essentially is calling for the eradication of Israel.
It's free Palestine.
I cannot understand why TfL say they cannot find who was responsible for it. I mean, I'd have thought that's quite an easy look through somebody's shift patterns. And then, because unless things like that are dealt with incredibly robustly, like you say, it just creates that sense of lack of security for so many people.
And can you say of partisanship? That some people are actually taking a side. I can understand a desire institutionally, particularly with journalistic organisations, to say we're not taking a side.
Yes.
And with the police as well. There's a protest, you have a legitimate right to protest, we're simply going to police it. But it feels like there are little cracks and there's a little bit of partisanship exposing itself, which to me just speaks to some ingrained prejudice in British society that I don't know why we can't just call it out and say, you know what, that's wrong, that's anti-Semitic. We don't tolerate that. Don't need a law on it. Just for goodness sake, organisations don't permit it and do not give it airtime.
Do you think there is an ingrained prejudice in some of our institutions here against Israel and perhaps even so far as saying against Jews?
I really hope not. I like to think not, but I think we should be vigilant for it. We should make sure that there isn't anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli sentiment anywhere in our public life and our institutions.
What would you suggest happens to the tube driver who was chanting?
Well, I think he needs to face discipline. I don't think that's acceptable, what happened there. I don't think it's acceptable for a public official to do that. I think just watching the clip, imagining people in the confined environment of a tube train, they can't even move away from it. It must have been a very threatening environment for some people on that train, or at least there's the risk that it was. I don't think it's acceptable, and I hope that the full disciplinary processes are followed.
I mean, I was really disappointed in the FA refusing to light up Wembley Park, Wembley Arch.
Yeah.
You know, we're really proud about Wembley, the FA at St George's up at Burton, next door to me in South Derbyshire. And you know, Rishi, the Prime Minister, was up there welcoming the fact that we're going to hold the Euros, and then the FA doesn't do this. They lit it up for France after the dreadful Bataclan incident, and they wouldn't do it for now. I mean, for goodness sakes.
Let's have a look at these pictures. These are from a vigil that was held yesterday in London in Trafalgar Square. You can see there people holding the Israeli flags and pictures of the 220 or so Israelis who were kidnapped by Hamas on October the 7th and taken back into Gaza. They're clutching signs that say, "Release the hostages." Alison and Tim, both of you talked about community tensions. This is very difficult being played out on the streets here, isn't it, in the UK?
Yes, and I mean, the tragedy, going back to the incident on the tube, can you imagine if you were a Jewish person that happened to be coming back from the shops or whatever when that incident happened, how utterly terrifying you would feel in your own country? And I think we are going to see more of this. We haven't even got to the point of the ground offensive into Gaza. We know that people in Gaza have been living under horrendous conditions for many, many years. That's about to become a whole lot worse. So those tensions are only going to be exacerbated. And there's absolutely no doubt that there's a very real chance this will spill out into real violence on our streets here as well.
And yet people must be allowed to protest in favour of a Palestinian state. Yes. And the line is difficult, isn't it, sometimes, in terms of policing it, in terms of talking about it. And it's always difficult when other groups, to some extent, take over what are legitimate protests.
And thousands of people protested peacefully. Many of them are motivated by a belief that the rights of Palestinians is a civil rights issue. Yeah. That's the way they see it, a human rights issue. And they also have legitimate questions to ask about how Israel responds, about the future of the two-state solution, whether or not the very conservative Israeli government is really pursuing one, and about the human rights of Gazans who are being put under extraordinary violent pressure within their own country. I just feel... It's difficult to put into words, but it feels as though there hasn't been a genuine, just full-throated, full emotional acknowledgement of the horror of what happened on October the 7th. There just feels like this is one occasion in which people couldn't just pause just to say, you know what, that was just terrible, and I totally condemn it. I'm not going to talk about politics for 24 hours. I'm not going to come up with moral equivalences and say, well, don't forget the borders in 1948. But there's just this strange sense with Israel that when something legitimately evil is done to it and to its people, then we suddenly all fall back into this position of neutrality and having a big conversation about it and all this sort of thing. Why can't we just pause and say, this was a pogrom, and we denounce it?
Let's talk about something entirely different. You remember back in August, there were reports of the first asylum seekers boarding a barge in Dorset called Bibi Stockholm. Now, the government's plan, we can show you pictures of it, was for this to house 506 asylum applicants whilst the Home Office made decisions on their cases. However, a few days later, the asylum seekers were evacuated due to fears over a confirmed Legionella bacteria outbreak on the barge. Now they're returning to Bibi Stockholm, and the first migrants were seen boarding the barge today. Our reporter Dan Johnson was one of the few reporters allowed on the barge and has spoken to residents.
This is a quiet part of the south coast, but over the summer the peace on Portland has been shattered.
They are not asylum seekers, they're illegal immigrants!
The community's divided.
These men have suffered. We have a right to treat them with dignity.
Charity begins at home.
And all because of this, a floating home for asylum seekers. I'm one of the handful of journalists invited on board. There's a gym, a TV room, and a sick bay. It's secure, but the men are not prisoners. They can step onto the quayside, there's no curfew, and buses take them into Weymouth.
There are 7,000 men. We're on Portland now.
It's been controversial from the start. It looks too grim for some people, not harsh enough to others. Anger here has turned inwards, creating rifts between Portlanders. Deeper issues have also come to the surface.
There's been a lot of threats.
I do walk into my house now and look over my shoulder before I walk in.
Lainey lives on Portland and campaigns against racism. She feels her views on the barge and the asylum seekers have made her a target.
Somebody who sent me a video of a woman who had claimed that she was raped by an asylum seeker with a message from him saying, "I hope you're next."
Lainey can't understand the attitudes from some people on the island.
I was really, really shocked by the response by some people. It was just deeply, deeply racist that these men are criminals, rapists, murderers.
Lainey's part of Stand Up to Racism, which has been opposing the vessel but welcoming the asylum seekers and trying to make them more comfortable.
We've got a notebook and pens for, obviously they'll be having English lessons and if they want to write things down.
But attitudes towards the barge here are mixed.
There is a lot of wealth, but there's also a lot of poverty.
Ian delivers spare food from supermarkets to those in need on the island.
You lot being here for a start with all that.
This was Ian on the day the first asylum seekers arrived.
If you want to make a difference to the people of Portland, take all this to the food bank.
That day you went down to the port, what was it that really made you angry, made you jump in the car?
I was just so annoyed that you welcome refugees, but what about the veterans? I think we've got five or six veterans that are homeless. They've got everything that a lot of people in Portland haven't got. People see it as a reminder of what your taxes are paying for. Your taxes aren't going to help you out, they're going to help out other people.
The government has given money to the local police, health service and council to cover extra costs linked to the barge and to fund activities for the asylum seekers. But in all the noise, one group wasn't being heard. The men actually stepping aboard weren't part of the debate. Many feared their families could be targeted or their asylum claims refused if they spoke openly. But the early reviews weren't great.
Our room is small. We can't even put clothes in the closet for one person. It's like a prison here.
I would love to stay here because...
This man says he left his country because his religious beliefs put him at risk.
I want to just because I want to save my life. We are in danger in there.
Why the UK then?
I feel safe in this country because everyone is free here to practice religion. I will try to build my own business and I'll try to take part in the economy of this country. I will make it better. It gives me protection, that's why. I will do everything for this country.
On Portland, the Islanders Club runs activities for young people.
And all these houses here look down on all that.
Sue manages the centre, which overlooks the port and is run entirely by volunteers.
There's kids up here that are deprived. They're seeing this is what money does for you. You know, it just gets me, I'm sorry.
Because there was supposed to be some development.
And Sue sees the division that's come with the barge.
You've got your people who are for it, you've got your people who are against it, obviously, because we don't get 3 meals a day and we've got parents that are struggling to feed their kids. We've got 3 food banks. You know, I've got nothing against the asylum seekers, personally. They've got to go somewhere. I don't agree with what they're living in. You know, it is like a prison cell. I wouldn't want to live in it. I just wish the government would think, we'll give the islands some incentive as well. We'll give them something.
Well, we're joined by Sue Beacock, who you just saw there, resident of Portland. Sue, we've seen the divisions exposed by the issue of the barge Bibi Stockholm. How do you think this can all be resolved?
I honestly don't know. I think the people of Portland need something that they feel they're being listened to. Like you say, there's people for it, people against it. Nobody's against the people themselves. They're human.
But it's interesting. Yeah, go on. Sorry. No, you finish your thought.
Nothing's been done for Portland, for the people, the children. I work with them every day, and it's so sad.
So you would like the government to actually do something visible for people in your community in order to try and ease the tensions that have arisen as a result of a migrant barge being there?
Yeah, give them something back. You know, there's 13,500 people on this island, 3,000 of which are children. The estate I'm working on is the second poor, deprived estate in the UK. You know, give them some help.
But you're not in favour of the barge either. You don't think it's the right way to house asylum seekers?
I don't think it's the right way to house people, no. You know, they are human beings. They shouldn't be on something that represents a prison ship.
All right, so we've got our guests here and politicians. Heather, do you want to respond to what Sue's saying, particularly about doing something for the people of Portland?
Yes, I will answer that, but I'm afraid I've got to obviously talk about the barge as well.
Yeah.
I'm really lucky. I've got two particular constituents who've come to me and told me that barge, that style of barge, was out in the Falklands. They were out there, they were living on it during that time. It was perfectly all right for our armed forces to live on it, so I'm very sorry. I'm not prepared to call it a prison ship at all. That's an outrageous statement, but we need to widen the conversation. So certainly if there's deprivation in Portland, then of course it needs to be looked at, and I'm sure Richard Drax is on it. I mean, he's been absolutely vociferous in Parliament about trying to get the Bibby barge moved on, but it's a perfectly adequate set of accommodation. What we really need to do is get through the asylum claims much, much quicker. That's what we need to do.
Sue, do you want to respond?
Well, as I say, I've got nothing against the people being down there. But, you know, they've got a doctor, they've got a dentist. We have got one dentist serving 13,500 people. I've got people in here that cannot get their children in for a dentist appointment. There is one doctor's surgery.
Well, and that
with
is...
about,
well, and that's...
you know...
Yeah, let me just put it to the Labour politician here. I mean, James, would you get rid of the barge?
Well, we don't want to be using barges if we're in government. Obviously, we would inherit, you know, the mess that the asylum system is in at the moment from this government.
You would keep it if you inherited
it. But what we'd want to do is get the backlog down, because, look, I think there are sort of two things coming together in what Sue set out there. Number one, we have deprivation in lots of parts of the country. We have a cost of living crisis which is hitting people hard, and we have public services falling apart when you're trying to find a GP appointment and so on. You know, there's all those problems that we're facing anyway, irrespective of whether the barge is there or not. You know, everyone is facing lots of difficulties in lots of parts of the country. On the other hand, we also have a chaotic asylum system where there's a huge backlog, where it's out of control, where the government has not got on top of it. And frankly, what we set out we would do is get on top of that backlog, get it down so that we wouldn't need to use barges in the first place and would have a proper functioning asylum system.
Let me just show you this headline in The Times. Tories stop using hotels in election battlegrounds for migrants. Conservative strategists hope that the move will ease anger over small boats. Now, there is a big difference, of course, Tim, between legal migration and what the government calls illegal migration, and these are asylum seekers that are being housed on the barge. But what is interesting is the impact it's having on local communities who don't want to be seen as being anti-asylum seeker, but do have concerns about barges like Bibby Stockholm being stationed there.
Well, watching your film, it seems, first of all, as if everyone's against the barge, either because they think it's cruel or because they don't want it in the area. And secondly, no one's against asylum seekers. They sound like they're largely complaining about the dearth of public services in the area, which is really rather more about austerity and economics. But of course, attention is focused on, and sometimes blame lands on asylum seekers for that, when really the issue is rather more to do with the governance of Britain. But having said that, let's not be dishonest. There is a debate about numbers and a debate about the pressure of numbers both upon people's wages and upon the delivery of public services. I think that's a broader national conversation, and some of us are sort of wet on asylum, but rather more critical, actually, of legal migration. To me, we've got it the wrong way round. Rather than fretting about whether or not we should provide safety for people who are fleeing from wars and political persecution, I think the question is why does a government that could control mass migration still allow record numbers of people to migrate to this country?
Heather?
That's an unbelievably interesting conversation because if you talk to any farmers, what they're interested in is the farm workers scheme. If you talk to IT people, they're interested in where they're going to get the next crop of IT people for. And it's not for want of our universities not putting out the IT people. It's just that we're growing so fast, we need more people to do these jobs. And obviously, we stick to the rule. You've advertised the job for 6 months. You can't get somebody. Then you can look at the group from elsewhere.
But of course, there you're speaking to employers, whereas employees who have to compete with migrants for jobs and have seen their wages suppressed because of mass migration might have a very different view upon the labour market.
Right, so the government have changed that round.
And the other question is, if you really need all these workers, why doesn't the government say that asylum seekers can work?
No, because we want to know who's coming into our country. When they said we don't know whether they're illegal criminals or rapists or whatever, the truth is we don't know. So we absolutely have to find out their background. When they come over and rip up their paperwork, you go around Thurrock when they're coming in there. You go into people's hedges. You can find documents in their hedges, for goodness sakes. And that tells you an awful lot about why they're coming here and what they think they're going to do once they're here.
But there still needs to be somewhere to house asylum seekers or migrants.
Yes.
And we're still talking about pretty significant numbers.
Yes, but we're not housing them in marginal constituencies in the run-up to an election.
Right. Is that right?
I don't know the answer to that
But
question.
it's looking that way at the moment. I just thought that was terribly tragic, Sue, who spoke last, in that she encapsulated the whole problem, the whole sense of people feeling that really hard done by after 13 years of austerity and the cost of living crisis. And then in that piece, you've got obviously people looking for somebody to blame, and the fear is that the asylum seekers become the person to blame. And it just seems that this mismanagement of A, the economy, and B, immigration has left us in this terrible situation, and it's real people who are paying the price.
And you will be inheriting it if you win the election next year, whenever it happens.
But we're very realistic about the mess we'd inherit, both in terms of the public finances and the economy and in terms of the
people like
chaos in the
Sue will be
asylum
expecting
system.
you to do something
exactly,
about this.
which is why we're setting out our plan for tackling it. So if you look at the asylum system and you look at the reason why people are being housed on the barges like this in the first place, it's because the backlog has been allowed to get out of control. So we set out our plan to get over 1,000 extra caseworkers to make sure we're processing them quicker, a returns unit to make sure people are returned if their application fails, make sure we're going after the criminal gangs in the first place, actually get on top of this situation so that we don't have to use places like barges in the first place.
I don't want to say this.
I'm just say processing large numbers very fast may well be a good thing, but it doesn't stop people coming to the country in the first place.
Well, that's why we need to go after the criminal gangs. That's why we said the criminal gangs who are smuggling people across the channel.
You did hear about that court case, didn't you, in Belgium? And then there's about 24 of them who have just gone to prison. And you know, we're going to get into a Dutch auction. We're actually increasing the number of civil servants, good God save us, by 2,000 to help with this issue. I mean, it's absolutely got to be done. But
well, let me just ask Sue. I mean, Sue, do you have any more faith in Labour, that a Labour government would do better with regards to these issues, or not?
I don't have any faith in anyone. Not in politics now. No. They're just after votes. They're not looking at the real people. And not just Portland, all around the country. All right. You know, they're paying out 8 million a day to homeless people.
Yes.
I'm looking for £5,000 to keep this club open because we've just failed our electrical installation thing. You know, and it's not right. They're being fed 3 meals a day. Good. That's brilliant. My kids that come to this club aren't.
All right, Sue, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let me show you this headline in The Sun. Long grass, it says. Law to ban trans and gay conversion therapy will not be in the King's speech amid Tory mutiny. That's in November, setting out the legislative programme of the government. It said that over 40 Tory MPs have signed a letter to the Prime Minister demanding he cancels the plans for a new law which has long been promised by the government. Are you one of those reported 40 MPs?
No, I haven't heard about this letter at all. That's fascinating.
Right, well, that's cleared that up. James, is this something that would have the support of the Labour Party, banning trans and gay conversion therapy?
We absolutely believe conversion therapy should be banned. And so-called therapy, let's not make it sound like anything nice. These are abhorrent conversion practices which force people to change their identity and so on. And we would ban that. You know, frankly, the government announced this first 5 years ago, and it's been on the table, off the table. Things have been coming in and out of it, you know, and now there's a battle within the Conservative Party about whether it goes ahead. I think people just want this legislation to be on the books, to ban these coercive practices, these awful conversion practices which cause so much damage to people and are frankly abusive. I mean, they should be banned.
Tim?
They're already banned. I mean, that language, coercive, abusive, that's illegal already. The problem with this legislation, well, first of all, just look at the politics. Theresa May introduced this when she was trying to be nice in 2018. Boris Johnson came and said, yes, we'll do that too. And then he thought about it and said, well, maybe we won't, but then maybe we will do it. But what we'll do is we'll specifically ban gay conversion therapy. We won't touch the trans stuff because that's so jolly controversial. And then having done that, Rishi Sunak came in, and last week it was announced, it was leaked last week that some ministers had said, if you do not ban conversion therapy, we will revolt. And then after the by-election on Friday, it was leaked that another group of MPs had said, actually, if you do try and ban it, we will revolt. So it now seems as if the government has changed its mind again. Why is it also controversial and difficult to do? Well, because of two things, really. First of all, it would place within the law a recognition of what we call gender ideology. It would stack the law in favour of the trans process and recognising that you can indeed change your sex with surgery, and that is a protected thing, and the law now backs you in your attempt to do that. And the second problem is it then lays a trap for anyone who disagrees with someone doing that, tries to persuade them or have a conversation with them about doing it, which could be religious groups. I mean, religion is a protected characteristic too. My church, the Catholic Church, does not believe that people can change their sex with surgery. If someone went to a priest and said, what do you think about me becoming a woman? And the priest said, well, according to our religion, that's not the case. Is that attempted conversion therapy? And the same goes with parents. And we've had cases in Canada and Australia which have also passed this sort of legislation. In the case of Canada, there was one father who actually ended up being arrested and going to prison because he insisted on referring to his daughter as a daughter. So this is the problem. We're back to the debate we had at the beginning about new legislation. You're laying traps when you actually have the law already there to ban this sort of stuff already.
Well, James, do you want to try and persuade Tim that actually it's necessary, as the Equality and Human Rights Commission says, legislation is needed to outlaw this practice?
So I think when conversion practices are carried out, they have an enormous psychological damaging effect on the people who are the victims of the abuse, essentially. Now, we've been really clear that we would want any ban to make clear that any non-directive counselling would be protected. Obviously, it wouldn't affect pastoral relationships, it wouldn't affect family conversations. But when you have this conversion practices which try and actually force people to change their identity, to change where they're coming from on this, it's not right. And I think, and it's
all the stuff you just described is illegal. And the other fear is that in the course of this bill going through Parliament, all that other stuff could be inserted.
Let him finish, and I'll come to you, Alison.
It's illegal.
So do you agree with me, but you think the law is there, or do you not agree with me?
No, I'm saying the law is already there to outlaw the kind of abusive, coercive practices that you are describing. It's already there.
Well, I simply disagree on that.
But there are people who have been through coercive therapies, and also people who work in this area who say that the law is not sufficient. So I think that's the point. Because there is the coercive, and I think there is a possibility around legislation that you could exempt parents, you could exempt some medical practitioners, and so the idea that it is parents were able to talk to their children about, their sexuality. That is just ramping up this situation, whereas I think there is a very sensible way you could create sensible legislation that could actually protect some people who have previously been at risk.
I mean, does that mean that actually it's the fault of the government who can't cope with the sort of legislation that would be necessary? As you said, it's too difficult to do, as Boris Johnson discovered or decided.
I think they came up with this without really thinking through the implications of it. And anyone who is sensitive, we were discussing this at the beginning of the programme, the problem with policing religious language, the problem also of policing intimate relationships between parents and children. The attempt by any government to try to legislate that, you are creating traps that whatever the specifics of the legislation as it is going to be put to Parliament, which can indeed be rewritten in the process, you are laying a trap in the future that those who wish to promote a certain perspective will be able to use that ideology, or people who will be able to use that legislation, or those who wish to defy, to get around any kind of counselling. But in a way, this is really very problematic.
In a way, what Tim's basically saying is that if we're going to do legislation, we need to get it right. Now, that should be obvious. Of course you need to get it right. You need to make sure that certain things are protected and certain things are banned. But that's what legislators are supposed to do.
And do you agree with James that that is what it's about? It's just that it is difficult to do, but there is a need for it in this case.
understanding was that the religious conversations and the family conversations were going to be exempted from the legislation. And so we were looking at the person and the individual and the safety of that individual.
But then what are you left with banning?
I guess you're left with these psychiatrists, psychologists who like to think that they're bigger than the problem.
And on that, that's all we have time for today. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15. But from all of us here, thank you first to all of our guests, and we'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.